Hello and welcome to another edition of Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. This week on the program, following President Bola Tinubu's recent trip to China for the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, we'll be speaking with former Deputy Head of Mission of the Nigerian Embassy in Beijing, Ambassador Chuka Udedibia. The president has already given himself a pass mark. He was speaking with members of the Nigerians in Diaspora organization at the China World Hotel in Beijing during the week, saying he'd had a very successful trip. Addressing the representatives, President Tinubu encouraged them to be good ambassadors of Nigeria in China, emphasizing the importance of discipline and commitment to national service, citing China's disciplined society as an example for Nigerians to follow. He said one key takeaway from his visit to China is the commitment to replicate China's infrastructure back home.
I want our children to be in good schools, not in tattered huts and dilapidated classrooms. You make teaching interesting and make business flourish. One economic action leads to another. It is in your hand to build our nation. Now is to provide the leadership that is necessary, and I'm committed to that.
While the president noted that it is not always easy for a leader to have a national consensus on issues, he is ready to take the hard decisions to move the nation forward. President of NIDO in China, Dr. Oche Barnabas, commended President Tinubu for his commitment to strengthening Nigeria's China relations, particularly in trade, investment, and people-to-people collaboration. He expressed NIDO China's support for Nigeria's 4D initiative at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs early in the year, and pledged that the organization is eager to drive it forward within the Diaspora Commission. While in China, President Bola Tinubu held talks with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, and both agreed to a comprehensive strategic partnership, as well as the elevation of China-Nigeria relations to a comprehensive strategic partnership. China committed to recognizing Nigeria as an influential African country with significant population and development potential. Both leaders agreed to enhance strategic mutual trust and support each other in core interests and major concerns. They discussed strengthening the alignment of development strategies, promoting integrated development in infrastructure, energy and minerals, and creating new growth points in the digital economy and new energy. China expressed support for Nigeria in combating terrorism and maintaining regional stability with a commitment to multilateral coordination. They both witnessed the signing of multiple cooperation documents related to the Belt and Road Initiative and other economic development projects. This sums up what the president's visit to China was all about. Let's just check in very quickly on those other discussions in diplomatic circles. We'll be right back for the discussion.
Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has begun a 3-day visit to China, with Beijing's anti-dumping probe into European Union pork imports as a backdrop. China and the European Union have been embroiled in a trade dispute after EU regulators announced provisional duties on Chinese-made electric vehicles. In retaliation, China opened anti-dumping investigations into brandy, dairy, and pork products from the EU. Jordanian authorities have announced an investigation into the shooting of 3 Israeli civilians on the Allenby Bridge border in the occupied West Bank. It was the first of its kind along the border with Jordan since the Palestinian Islamist group Hamas carried out an assault on southern Israel on October the 7th, sparking the war in Gaza. that has heightened tensions across the region.
To discuss the outcome of President Bola Tinubu's visit to China, I have joining me former Deputy Head of Mission at the Nigerian Embassy in Beijing, China. He is also Acting Permanent Secretary and former Undersecretary, Director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the United Nations Department. He is also former Ambassador, Acting Permanent Secretary, and Undersecretary and Director at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Nigeria with the United Nations Department. He was also Undersecretary, Admin and Finance, and is also former Ambassador, representative of Nigeria to the Netherlands, and Acting Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Affairs Ministry. Ambassador Chuka Udedibia was also in the presidency as a former Director of Political Affairs and political affairs, right? And at the presidency, he wears many caps, of course. His profile so long, and it's really difficult to get to each and every one of them. But you have had quite the experience, Ambassador Chuka. It's a real pleasure having you on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
And we're pleased to have you. And we're talking about...
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's my pleasure that you are here. We're talking about President Bola Tinubu's visit to China. It was an official trip. His first visit, I believe, to China, but it was also to attend the Forum on China-Africa Consultative Forum. That's the FOCAC. President Tinubu gave himself a pass mark while he was speaking to Nigerians in Diaspora Organization in Beijing, China. He gave himself a pass mark, saying that his trip has been very successful. He was not even back in the country when he gave himself this pass mark. What do you think?
I will hesitate to speak about his pass mark. I prefer to talk about the visit to China and the FOCAC itself, that is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which was the main reason he traveled to China. Personally, and I think many Nigerian diplomats share the same view, I do not support Africa as a continent. All African leaders traveling to individual countries as a group to hold cooperation, or rather, hold cooperation meetings or arrangements with those countries. We've had China, we have China, Africa, US, the same forum, Africa, UK, Africa, France, Africa, Turkey, Africa, Iran, all these have taken place. You know, I think, to me, it means belittling the continent, because relations are supposed to be bilateral. These are individual countries, each of which also has bilateral relations with each of the African countries. So it's belittling the prestige of Africa, and when Africa goes to some of these, African leaders travel to some of these countries in groups as a mass, some of these individual countries, they really do not benefit much, because these countries talk to them as if they are not worth much.
I was going to say, while you do not like the idea of African countries having these bilateral summits, these summits by individual countries with the whole continent China has made a lot of investment in Africa and is planning to invest even much more. President Xi Jinping announced that China will be investing $50 billion into Africa, and that will cover a number of infrastructure projects and so on. And Nigeria itself is one of the countries where China is heavily invested. They do have a partnership where Nigeria has promised to protect some of these projects that China is, and to protect Chinese investment and Chinese businesses in Nigeria, while China has also been, very visible in Nigeria's infrastructure projects. You have the airports that were renovated. You have railway systems that have been built thanks to China. You also have roads in some instances. How do you then, ignore such a power that has invested so much in your country?
I do not ignore Nigeria's bilateral relations with China at all. China has been doing a lot in Nigeria. And in fact, much of the initiatives that China undertakes in Nigeria, or some of the projects, were actually on China's initiative, not necessarily Nigeria. But before the launching of, because the FOCAC, that is the Forum on Africa-China Relation, or China-Africa Cooperation, was launched in 2013. Before that project, some of these projects, before that cooperation arrangement, some of these projects have been ongoing in case of Nigeria and other African countries. Now, when China launched that project, now it connected it to its Belt and Road Initiative, which it is undertaking in 60 countries, including some countries in Europe. I know Italy is one of them. And of course, that is understandable. But the point I'm making, while I appreciate what China has done for Africa and for Nigeria in particular, at the same time, all that could be done bilaterally. We derive much mutual benefits when countries talk one-on-one, when they relate to each other one-on-one. Rather than a group of African countries going to meet one single or singular nation, and then Africa becomes an object of those countries. I don't think it's right. Talking specifically about Nigeria's relations with China, of course, we have benefited so much in our relations with China. I'm glad that you mentioned some of the projects. There are many. Look at the Mambila hydropower project, which China is financing up to the tune of 85%, and this is almost a $6 billion project. Look at the Zungeru hydropower project. In fact, the Mambila project is expected to come on stream in 2030. The Zungeru hydropower project is also going on. The deep sea, the Lekki deep sea water project, the Abuja Kefi, Lafia, Makurdi dualization project, and so many others. Okay, the pipeline, the Ajokuta Kaduna Kano gas pipeline project, there's just so many of them. These projects could still go on without African leaders, going like students to their class teacher. It's not proper. We are sovereign countries and should relate to other sovereign countries on bilateral basis as sovereign nations. And each country established what we call joint commissions to handle their relations, their bilateral economic relations. Now, yes, it's true. China pledged $51 billion to Africa to support infrastructure or infrastructural development in the continent. China has been doing it, and I think Africa has benefited a great deal from it. Related to Nigeria in particular, we have benefited a lot, like I said, in our relations with China, in respect of Chinese projects in the country. But that's why I'm talking about bilateral relations. That is, one country relating with another. But it is not just about projects. There is also bilateral trade. There is also trade in services. There are so many aspects of bilateral relations. How have we fared in all these other areas? For example, Nigeria and Nigeria's trade with China has grown exponentially since 1995, that we, I'm happy to have been part of it, launched the Nigerian-China close relations, as it has been growing since then. And then in 1998, Nigeria recorded about $400 million trade volume with China. By 2006, this trade volume had gotten up to $3 billion US, either $3 billion or $4 billion. And as at the end of 2023, it has grown to $23 billion US. You can see how rapidly it's been growing, making Nigeria the second largest trading partner, Chinese trading partner in Africa. Now, the question is, what do we benefit from that? Because the total trade volume, like I said, is 23 billion. Our exports to China out of that amount is 1.5 or 1.61 billion. That of China, 21.5 billion dollars. So we are suffering a trade deficit to the tune of over $20 billion, about $21 billion in trade. So these are the areas we have to look at. We have to work domestically to make sure that we are in a position to relate with these countries and mutually benefit from such a relation, not just going to China to be giving loans and all that.
Why do you think we're not taking advantage, as much of an advantage, of our relations with China or any of these other countries that the president has been visiting? Why do you think we're not taking advantage of that? Some of these ideas that you have put forward, I'm sure that this is not the first time that you've spoken about these ideas. You were deputy head of mission back in the 2000s. So I would expect that, the government should have learned by now. Well, sorry, in the 90s. So I'd expect that by now we should have moved forward on these things. But I'm sure that the same issues that we're talking about today are the same issues that you were talking about when you were deputy head of mission. Why do you think we keep stalling in our relations with these countries, and we don't take advantage of the same opportunities that these treaties and these agreements that we have with them present to both sides?
For many years, we have been conducting our foreign relations from a particular point of view or from a particular direction from which we have not benefited as such. If you look at Nigerian records of economic relations with other countries, we have so many agreements, so many. Sometimes multiple agreements on one area, that if Nigeria has benefited from some of these agreements at the rate with which we entered into them, by now we'll be competing with Singapore. The truth is that when we enter into some of these agreements, or some of these bilateral discussions, it ends in nothing. That is the reality. We have to have something to offer. We have to organize our economy. We have to have something to export. We have to have services to render. Okay, for example, in shipping, which is one of the services in the area of services, Chinese Costco. In fact, at a point, Nigerian National Shipping Line was carrying goods outside this country more than Costco, because at that time, the Chinese opening up, the opening of the Chinese economy, which occurred in 1978 at the behest of Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader at the time, had not happened. You know, today our national shipping line, NNSL, is practically non-existent. So when we ship goods to China, it is the same Chinese airline, the Costco, that ships the goods to China and make our profit. You know, the national shipping line, we don't even have it in the first place. I gave that example with respect to flights. And we already have flights. Yes, there is no more Nigerian Airways, but we have other Nigerian private airlines that fly us out of this country. When you sit down with a country and you present your demands, they respect you. And where you don't have the demands to present, you grow them. These are things that boost the economy, you know. And when we keep borrowing, even suffering budget deficits year after year, is because we are not growing our economy. That is very clear. I'm not just talking about this government. I'm talking of government decades past, because it did not start today. So that trend has continued up to today. That's the point I'm making. We have to get serious. Let me just summarize.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Do you think you have an idea of what Nigeria's foreign policy is presently?
And the whole world?
Yes, Nigeria's foreign policy towards China and the rest of the world.
Our foreign policy, we have a well-articulated foreign policy that was in fact pronounced in 1960, I think soon after our independence, by the Prime Minister at the time, Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. And that foreign policy is so, you know, when you make a good policy, it lasts, it is green, it lasts forever, you know. So it was so well articulated that Nigeria has followed it religiously, so faithfully, till today. But the problem is in implementation. And the implementation is not about the Minister of Foreign Affairs. No. The Minister of Foreign Affairs can only implement what we have done domestically. That's the only thing it can implement abroad. So we have the ministry as a tool to project our foreign policy. But growing that economy, making arrangements for that foreign policy to work, you know, has to be done by Nigeria itself. Nobody can do it for us, or no country can do it for us. And with China in particular, you know, we have excellent relations. Our foreign policy towards China and China's foreign policy towards Nigeria, as far as I'm concerned, are excellent. We established our relations in China in 1971 when China had no friends. When many countries were running away from China, the way, just exactly what is happening with North Korea today. As far as I'm concerned, the problem is with us. China is projecting its interest, is pursuing its interest. My question is, what is Nigeria's interest in its relations with China and other countries of the world?
What do you think the interest is?
And what are we doing about it?
What do you think is our interest?
Sorry?
What do you think is Nigeria's interest with China?
Oh, interest, there are many. There are many. I've mentioned some of them. You know, there are just many. What do we need? That's why it's called foreign relations, foreign policy. You know, we establish relations with, the same with international organizations. You know, we have these missions, we have these relations with these countries bilaterally, you know, and we establish diplomatic missions, permanent relations by establishing embassies and consulates and consulate generals in these countries. You know, it was with a purpose. These plans were laid out, the reasons were given, you know, there were certain things some of those countries need, produce that we need, and so many things we produce or we should produce that those countries need. So we establish these relations to pursue these interests. But when after establishing the relations, we don't pursue them, they pursue theirs. And in the end, we suffer the deficits.
You're giving us a lot to think about, Ambassador
You
Chuka.
see, we are running a mono-export economy. Let me say this. It's very important. And that is actually the summary of all I'm saying. We are running a mono-export economy, oil and oil and oil, maybe also gas. No country will succeed on mono-export economy. There are so many areas of bilateral relations, so many, and even in that mono-export economy, the deficit is so huge. It's not just China. It's the same with the rest of the world.
We definitely have to have you come back to join us again to continue this conversation. Ambassador Chuka Udedibia, thank you for joining us on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you very much for having me. I'll be pleased to appear on China's television whenever you call on me.
This is where we end the program this week. Let us know whether you, like the president, thinks his visit to China was a success. The addresses to reach me on are on your screen. I'm Amarachi Ubani. I'll see you next time.